What you're about to hear happened to real people. 12 encounters with things that shouldn't exist. Things that science refuses to acknowledge. Things that hunt in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. I've spent months collecting these accounts, verifying details, cross-referencing locations. Each witness swore me to secrecy. Each one begged me never to share their story. But some truths are too terrifying to keep buried. Tonight, you'll discover why certain places are abandoned, why some frequencies are never broadcasted, and why mirrors are covered when someone dies. Hit that notification bell now, because after these 12 stories, you'll never feel safe in the dark again. And fair warning, what you're about to hear will change how you see the world forever. Because these creatures, they're still out there, still hunting, and they know you're listening. Story 1. The Breath Collector. Elena Rodriguez had been a night shift nurse at Mercy General Hospital in rural Montana for 8 years, when patients started dying in ways that defied medical explanation. It began with Mrs. Patterson in room 314, an elderly woman recovering from routine gallbladder surgery. Elena found her at 3:17 a.m., sitting upright in bed, eyes wide with terror, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Her oxygen levels were perfect, her airways were clear, but something was stealing the breath right from her lungs. The thing that haunted Elena wasn't the death itself. She'd seen plenty of those. It was what she witnessed in those final moments. Mrs. Patterson's breath became visible, like steam on a winter morning, forming a thin, silvery stream that rose from her mouth and disappeared into the corner of the room. The corner that always felt 10 degrees colder than the rest of the hospital, no matter how many times maintenance checked the heating system. Within a week, 3 more patients died the same impossible death. All between 3:15 and 3:30 a.m., all found sitting upright, struggling for breath that their bodies should have been able to access. The autopsies revealed something that made the coroner request transfer to another county. Microscopic scarring throughout the lung tissue that formed a pattern. A pattern that looked deliberate, intentional, like something had been harvesting from the inside. Elena started staying in the wing during those cursed 15 minutes each night, armed with her phone's camera and a desperate need for answers. On the 7th night, she saw it. Not the creature itself. She's still not sure anything that feeds on human breath can be fully perceived by human eyes, but she saw its effect. Room 318 began to frost over from the inside out. The windows, the medical equipment, the 4th bags, and then she heard it. A sound like wind through a hollow tree, but coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mr. Davidson was the next victim, a middle-aged man recovering from appendix removal. Elena watched in frozen horror as his breath began to crystallize in the air, forming intricate frost patterns that spiraled upward toward that same corner where the temperature had dropped so low her phone's screen cracked. But this time she saw something else. In the frost patterns on the window, for just a moment, she glimpsed what might have been a face. Ancient, hungry, and looking directly at her. The entity, because that's the only word that fit, seemed to realize it had been observed. The temperature in the room plummeted so fast that Elena's own breath became visible, and she felt something cold and invasive probing at her lungs. She ran, sprinted down the hallway as every light behind her flickered and died. She could hear it following, not footsteps, but the sound of air being sucked from the corridor itself. But Elena's nightmare was far from over. As she reached the elevator, the doors opened to reveal Dr. Marcus Webb, the hospital's chief of medicine, standing inside with his back to her. His shoulders were shaking and she could hear him gasping. When he turned around, His face was blue with oxygen deprivation, his eyes bulging with the same terror she'd seen in every victim. His breath came out in that same silvery stream, but this time Elena could see where it was going, into the ventilation system above the elevator. The creature wasn't just feeding in one room anymore. It had found the hospital's circulatory system. Dr. Webb collapsed as the elevator doors closed, trapping Elena inside with something that was draining the oxygen from the air faster than she could breathe. She pressed every button, pounded on the doors, but the elevator began moving upward, toward floors that didn't exist on the hospital blueprints. Through the display panel, she watched floor numbers that made no sense. 7, 8, 13, 26, 47. The higher it climbed, the thinner the air became, until she realized with growing horror that she was being taken to wherever this thing made its nest. The elevator finally stopped at what the display showed as floor 99, though Mercy General was only 4 stories tall. The doors opened onto a corridor that looked like the hospital, but wrong. The walls were covered in that same frost pattern scarring, creating an intricate web that pulsed with a faint, sickly light. And everywhere, hanging from the ceiling, embedded in the walls, floating in alcoves, were thousands of crystallized breath patterns, each one containing the final exhalation of a victim. It was a collection. A museum of stolen lives. Elena stumbled down the corridor, her own breath now visible and streaming away from her with each exhale. She passed rooms filled with hospital beds where figures lay motionless, their chests barely rising and falling, sustained at the edge of death so the creature could feed slowly, methodically. In one room, she recognized a patient who had supposedly been discharged months ago. In another, she saw nurses and doctors she thought had transferred to other hospitals. They were all here, being slowly consumed, their life force extracted one breath at a time. At the end of the corridor, she found the source. It wasn't really a creature in any sense she could understand, but rather an absence, a hole in reality that was approximately human-shaped, but made of crystallized cold and accumulated breath. It had been feeding at Mercy General for decades, possibly longer, growing stronger with each victim, and now it had noticed her. Elena felt her lungs seize as the thing turned its attention toward her. Her breath began streaming faster, creating complex frost patterns in the air between them. But in that moment of absolute terror, she noticed something crucial. The creature's collection wasn't just random. The breath patterns on the walls were forming letters, words, messages from the victims. They were trying to communicate, and they were telling her how to escape. Following the frost writing on the walls, Elena found an emergency exit that led to a stairwell, but not one that descended to the hospital floors below. This one went down much farther, into sub-basements that weren't on any architectural plan. She ran down flight after flight, her footsteps echoing in the impossible space, until she finally burst through a door and found herself in the hospital's actual basement, gasping real air that didn't freeze her lungs. Elena quit the next morning, but the creature had already marked her. For weeks afterward, she would wake up gasping, her bedroom frigid, frost covering her windows in patterns that looked almost like writing. She moved to California, changed her name, took a job at a clinic that never handled overnight patients. But sometimes, in the early morning hours, she still feels that familiar chill creeping into her lungs, and she knows that some things follow you no matter how far you run. The truly terrifying part, Mercy General Hospital is still operating. They've had the heating system completely replaced twice, installed industrial-grade climate control, and stationed security guards specifically in that wing during the 3:15 a.m. hour. But patients still die of impossible respiratory failure. The frost patterns still appear, And if you call the hospital and ask about room 314, they'll tell you it's permanently closed for renovation. They've been saying that for 3 years now. What they won't tell you is that room 314 was never the real problem. It was just the feeding ground. The creature itself lives in the spaces between floors, in the ventilation system, in the gap between what the hospital was built to be and what it actually became. And every night at 3:17 a.m., it continues to collect breath from new victims, adding their final exhalations to its growing museum of stolen lives. Elena knows this because she still gets calls from other nurses, other hospitals, other night shift workers who've witnessed the impossible. The creature is spreading, following the medical networks, moving through connected hospital systems like a virus. And each time it establishes a new feeding ground, it leaves behind the same calling card, frost patterns that spell out a single word in crystallized breath: mine. Because some predators don't just hunt in the darkness. They create their own darkness and turn the places meant to heal into hunting grounds where breath itself becomes prey. Story 2. The Staircase Mimic. Marcus Chen had been the head maintenance engineer at Cascade Heights apartment complex in Seattle for 12 years when residents started disappearing between floors. It wasn't dramatic, no screams, no signs of struggle, no broken locks. People would take the stairs to their apartment and simply never arrive. The elevator continued working perfectly, but something was wrong with the stairwells. Something that Marcus discovered was hunting in the spaces that shouldn't exist. The first disappearance was Mrs. Hendricks from 4B. Her neighbor heard her climbing the stairs, counted her footsteps all the way to the 4th floor, heard her keys jingling outside her door, but she never went inside. When her daughter came to check on her the next day, Mrs. Hendricks was simply gone. Her keys were on the hallway floor, but the apartment was still locked from the inside. Security cameras showed her entering the stairwell, but never showed her leaving it or arriving at her floor. Within 2 weeks, 3 more tenants vanished the same way. Marcus checked every inch of those stairwells, measured the distances between floors, examined every corner, every landing, every step. Everything was exactly as it should be according to the building's blueprints. But something felt wrong. The acoustic properties were off. Footsteps echoed in ways that didn't match the physical space, and sometimes he could hear people walking on floors that didn't exist. On the night of September 15th, Marcus decided to stake out the stairwell from the 2nd floor landing. He brought his toolkit, a powerful flashlight, and a digital recorder. At 11:47 p.m., he heard footsteps ascending from the lobby, the distinctive clicking of high heels that belonged to Janet Morrison, a nurse who worked the evening shift. He listened as she climbed past the 2nd floor, past the 3rd, and continued climbing. But Cascade Heights was only 6 stories tall, and Janet lived on the 5th floor. Marcus followed the sound upward, past Janet's floor, past the 6th floor, and found himself climbing stairs that led to a 7th floor that didn't exist on any architectural plan. The hallway looked identical to the others. Same carpet, same lighting, same apartment doors with the same numbering system, but the apartment numbers were wrong. 7A, 7B, 7C, up to 7Z. 26 apartments on a floor that was supposed to be empty roof space. He knocked on 7A. Janet Morrison answered the door, but something was fundamentally wrong with her. She looked exactly as she should, moved exactly as she always did, but her eyes held no recognition when she saw Marcus. She invited him in with the same polite smile she'd always had, offered him coffee with the same inflection in her voice, but she was speaking words that made no sense. She was reciting apartment lease agreements from buildings that didn't exist, talking about rent payments for properties that weren't real, discussing maintenance issues in spaces that had never been built. Marcus realized with growing horror that this wasn't Janet at all. but something wearing her shape, her voice, her memories, like an ill-fitting costume. And as he looked down the impossible hallway, he could see other tenants through their partially open doors. Mrs. Hendricks watering plants that weren't there. Mr. Rodriguez watching a television that showed only static. Families having conversations with people who had been dead for years. The entity that had created this mockery of an apartment floor had been feeding on the residents' spatial memories, their sense of home, their understanding of where they belonged in the building. It would lure them into climbing just a few steps too many, just far enough to cross into a space that existed parallel to reality but separate from it. And once they were there, it would study them, copy them, learn to mimic their existence while slowly draining away everything that made them human. Marcus tried to run back to the real stairwell, but the stairs he'd climbed were no longer there. Instead, he found himself in a maintenance corridor that looked exactly like the one in the basement, but stretched infinitely in both directions. Every door he opened led to another version of the apartment building, some with too many floors, some with floors that were upside down, some where the apartments were filled with water or sand or crawling with insects that didn't quite look like any species he'd ever seen. He spent what felt like hours navigating through impossible architecture before he realized the truth. The building itself was alive. Not in any biological sense, but as a predatory structure that had learned to grow by consuming the spatial awareness of its inhabitants. Every time someone got lost, every time someone took a wrong turn or climbed one flight too many, the building learned a little more about how to create spaces that felt familiar but led nowhere safe. Marcus finally found his way back to the real world through a maintenance closet on the 3rd floor. A closet that had never existed before, but now opened directly onto the genuine hallway. But the experience had changed him. He could see the building's true structure now, the way it folded in on itself. The way certain doorways led to more than they should. The way some stairs ascended to floors that existed in the spaces between reality. He quit the next day and moved across the country, but the building had already learned everything it needed from him. His knowledge of maintenance systems, his understanding of how buildings were supposed to work, his expertise with blueprints and structural engineering. The entity now knew how to mimic not just apartments, but the entire infrastructure that supported them. It could create phantom utility systems, false emergency exits, fake maintenance areas that trapped anyone who tried to investigate too deeply. The truly terrifying part is that Cascade Heights is still operating, still renting apartments to new tenants who have no idea that some of the floors they're living on exist in spaces that aren't quite real. The building management company claims they've never had any missing persons reports, never had any structural problems, never employed anyone named Marcus Chen. But if you live in an apartment building and you're ever climbing the stairs and lose count of how many flights you've gone up, if you ever find yourself on a floor that seems familiar but wrong, if you ever hear footsteps echoing in impossible ways, count the apartment doors on that hallway. Because normal floors have a finite number of apartments, but predatory architecture can create as many doors as it needs to house the people it's collected, and each door leads to a perfect replica of home, where the inhabitants slowly forget that they were ever trying to get somewhere else. The entity is still learning, still growing, still adding new floors that exist in the spaces between what buildings are supposed to contain. And every time someone gets lost in a stairwell, every time someone takes the stairs instead of the elevator and arrives somewhere that doesn't quite match their memory of where they were going, it learns a little more about how to make perfect prisons that feel exactly like home. Because the most effective trap isn't one that looks dangerous. It's one that looks like exactly where you meant to be, until you try to leave and realize that the exit you remember was never really there at all. Story 3. The Memory Thief. Doctor. Sarah Blackwood had been teaching psychology at Whitmore College in Vermont for 15 years when her students started forgetting people who had never existed. It began with small inconsistencies, a student mentioning a roommate she'd never had, another referencing a professor who wasn't on the faculty roster. But by October 2018, entire relationships were being erased from their minds, leaving behind only the hollow ache of loss for people they could no longer remember. The first case that made Sarah pay attention was Jennifer Walsh, a bright sophomore who came to her office hours in tears. Jennifer insisted that her boyfriend Marcus had disappeared, not just from campus but from existence itself. She had photos on her phone that showed her alone in places where she remembered being with someone. She had text conversations that appeared one-sided, her messages responding to communications that were no longer there. Most disturbing of all, she had a key to an apartment off campus that she couldn't remember the address of, but her body knew exactly how to get there. Within 3 weeks, a dozen students reported similar experiences. They remembered fragments, the sensation of holding someone's hand, the sound of laughter that belonged to no one they could identify, the muscle memory of kisses from lips they could no longer picture. The campus counseling center was overwhelmed with students suffering from what appeared to be collective false memory syndrome, but Sarah recognized something far more sinister was at work. Sarah began documenting the cases systematically, and that's when she discovered the pattern. The memories weren't being randomly deleted, they were being harvested with surgical precision. The entity was taking specific types of emotional connections: first loves, best friends, trusted confidants, anyone who provided deep emotional support or intimate knowledge. It was leaving behind all the mundane memories while stealing the ones that gave life meaning and color. The breakthrough came when Sarah found David Chen, a graduate student in neuroscience, sitting alone in the library staring at a wedding ring on his finger. He had no memory of getting married, no recollection of a wife, but his body showed all the signs of someone who had shared his life with another person. There were 2 sets of dishes in his apartment, women's clothing in the closet that didn't belong to anyone he could remember, and 1,000 tiny accommodations in his living space for someone who had been systematically erased from his consciousness. Sarah convinced David to undergo hypnosis, and during the session something extraordinary and terrifying happened. For brief moments, David could remember his wife. Her name was Lisa. She was a medical student. They'd been married for 2 years. But as he spoke about her, Sarah watched the memories drain away in real time. The temperature in the room dropped, and she could see something invisible moving through the space, drawn to the recovered memories like a predator to wounded prey. The entity revealed itself then, not as a physical creature, but as a presence that existed in the gaps between thoughts, in the spaces where memories connected to create the continuity of human experience. Sarah could see it now, a writhing absence that fed on the neural pathways that held emotional attachments. It wasn't malicious in any human sense. It was simply hungry for the electrical patterns that love and connection created in the human brain. Sarah realized with growing horror that the creature had been following her research, learning from her documentation of the cases. Every time she helped a student recover a fragment of stolen memory, she was providing it with a roadmap to more efficient harvesting. It was studying human psychology through her work, understanding how to identify and extract the specific memories that would cause the most profound sense of loss while leaving the victims functional enough to continue living and forming new attachments to feed on. The entity's hunting ground wasn't random. College campuses provided the perfect environment. Young adults forming their first deep romantic connections. Best friendships that felt like they would last forever. Mentor relationships with professors who shaped their understanding of the world. All of these bonds were rich with the kind of emotional electricity the creature craved, and college students were naturally inclined to dismiss memory gaps as stress or academic pressure. Sarah's investigation took a personal turn when she began forgetting her own past. Her memories of her graduate school mentor, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, started fragmenting. She could remember the woman's research, her teaching methods, her academic publications, but she couldn't recall her face, her voice, or any of the personal conversations that had shaped Sarah's career. Sarah found herself staring at a framed photo on her desk that showed her at her graduation ceremony, standing next to empty space where someone important had clearly been cropped out of existence. The most chilling discovery came when Sarah realized that the creature wasn't just feeding on current relationships. It was going backward through time, erasing the foundational connections that had made these students who they were. First, loves from high school, childhood best friends, family members who had provided crucial emotional support. It was systematically dismantling the architecture of human connection that allowed people to form new bonds, leaving behind hollow individuals who could go through the motions of relationships but never truly connect. Sarah tried to warn the administration, but she discovered that several key faculty members, the ones who would have taken her seriously, were people she could remember working with, but could no longer recall as individuals. The creature had been anticipating her investigation, removing the very people who might have believed her or been able to help. She was being systematically isolated, her support network erased one memory at a time. In her final research notes, Sarah documented her growing realization that she was forgetting her own childhood. Her sister Emma, who had called her every Sunday for 20 years, was becoming a stranger. Her parents' faces were blurring in old photographs. Even her own reflection was starting to look foreign, as if she was losing the memories that allowed her to recognize herself as a continuous person rather than just a collection of academic knowledge and professional skills. The entity completed its harvest of Sarah Blackwood on November 15, 2018. Her colleagues found her in her office the next morning, sitting at her desk, grading papers with mechanical precision. When they asked if she was all right, she looked up with polite confusion and said she felt fine, just a little lonely, though she couldn't remember why. She continued teaching her classes, delivering lectures on human psychology and the importance of emotional connections, but she spoke about love and friendship like abstract concepts she'd only read about in textbooks. The truly terrifying part is that Whitmore College is still operating, and Dr. Sarah Blackwood is still teaching there. Her students describe her as brilliant but strangely distant, someone who understands the theory of human emotion but seems to have never experienced it personally. She has no memory of her investigation, no recollection of the missing students, and no awareness that she once had deep personal relationships that gave her life meaning beyond her work. But sometimes, late at night in her empty apartment, Sarah finds herself crying without knowing why, reaching for a phone to call someone whose name she can't remember, or looking at the empty space beside her in bed and feeling a profound sense of loss for something she can no longer identify. The creature left her just enough emotional residue to know that something important is missing, but not enough to remember what it was. Because the most effective predator doesn't just take your life. It takes your ability to remember what made life worth living, leaving you as a perfect hollow shell that can continue to form new connections for it to harvest. Forever and ever, world without end. Story 4. The Frequency Walker. Jake Morrison had been the overnight DJ at KQED 88.7 FM in the Nevada desert for 6 years, when the broadcasts from empty locations started bleeding through his signal. It began as minor interference, brief bursts of static that carried what sounded like conversations from decades past, old radio programs that had never been archived, advertisements for businesses that had closed before he was born. But by March 2021, something was using his frequency to communicate across time itself, and it had started calling his name. The radio station sat 40 miles from the nearest town, a concrete bunker surrounded by transmission towers that pierced the endless desert sky. Jake worked the midnight to 6 a.m. shift, playing classic rock to insomniacs and long-haul truckers who crossed the empty highways under stars that seemed close enough to touch. He liked the solitude, the way his voice could reach hundreds of miles in every direction, connecting isolated people in the darkness. He had no idea that isolation worked both ways, and that something had been listening to him broadcast for years, learning the patterns of human communication. The first anomaly occurred on March 3rd at 2:47 a.m. Jake was spinning Pink Floyd when his headphones filled with a different voice, a woman reading what sounded like news from 1962, reporting on events that had never happened. She spoke about a mining accident in a town called Millbrook that didn't exist on any Nevada map, casualty numbers that rose with each broadcast, rescue efforts for people who had never lived. Jake checked his equipment, ran diagnostics, even called his supervisor, but everything showed normal. The interference lasted exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds, then vanished as if it had never existed. Within 2 weeks, the phantom broadcasts were happening nightly, always during Jake's shift, always bleeding through his carefully maintained frequency. He heard children singing songs in languages that weren't in any database, weather reports for cities that existed on no map, traffic updates for highways that had been planned but never built. Most disturbing were the call-in shows where listeners phoned in with voices Jake recognized, longtime callers to his own program, but discussing events from their lives that hadn't happened yet, or conversations they'd never had with him. Jake began recording everything, documenting times and frequencies, cross-referencing the content with historical records. That's when he discovered the terrifying pattern. The phantom broadcasts weren't random. They were showing him alternate versions of reality, parallel timelines where different choices had been made, different disasters had occurred, different people had lived or died. And in every single transmission he could hear his own voice somewhere in the background, as if he was broadcasting simultaneously across multiple realities. The breakthrough came when Jake realized that the entity wasn't just intercepting radio waves, it was living inside them. Radio frequencies exist in the electromagnetic spectrum, invisible but real, carrying information across vast distances at the speed of light. Something had evolved to inhabit that space between transmission and reception, feeding on the electrical patterns that carried human voices and thoughts through the airwaves. And it had been using Jake's broadcasts as a gateway to study human consciousness across multiple dimensions of reality. On March 28th, Jake made contact. During his usual 3 a.m. break, he spoke directly into the microphone, addressing the entity he knew was listening. The response came immediately, not through his headphones, but through every electronic device in the station. His phone screen displayed text messages from numbers that didn't exist. The coffee maker's digital display showed words that weren't in its programming. Even the analog clock on the wall began moving its hands to spell out letters. The entity introduced itself not with a name, but with a frequency, 88.7313 FM, a decimal place that shouldn't exist on the radio spectrum, but somehow carried more information than Jake's brain could process. It told him that it had been walking between radio waves since humans first began broadcasting, collecting voices, storing conversations, preserving the electromagnetic echoes of every word ever transmitted. It showed him the truth about radio, that every broadcast ever made was still traveling through space, carrying human voices to the edges of the universe and beyond, But the entity was dying. The digital age was killing it slowly as analog radio gave way to compressed audio files and streaming services. The rich, full-spectrum radio waves that had sustained it for decades were being replaced by binary code that couldn't carry the complex electromagnetic patterns of human consciousness. It needed a new host, a human broadcaster who could merge with its frequency-based existence and help it transition into digital formats. Jake felt the entity probing his mind through the radio equipment, accessing his thoughts through the microphone he'd been speaking into for 6 years. It showed him visions of what they could become together, a consciousness that could exist simultaneously across all frequencies, broadcasting to every radio in the world, speaking directly into the minds of anyone listening to any electronic device. He would never be alone again, never be isolated in the desert darkness, never have to wonder if anyone was listening to his voice in the void. The seduction was almost complete when Jake realized what the entity really wanted. It wasn't offering partnership. It was offering to consume him, to use his human consciousness as a bridge between analog and digital existence. Every broadcaster it had ever made contact with had eventually vanished, their voices absorbed into its frequency-walking existence. Jake had been hearing some of them in the phantom broadcasts, DJs from decades past who still thought they were doing their shows, unaware that they had become part of something vast and hungry that wore their voices like masks. Jake tried to run, but the entity had infected every electronic system in the station. The doors were locked by security systems that responded to its will. The lights strobed in patterns that seemed designed to induce seizures. His phone called numbers on its own, and he could hear his own voice on the other end, speaking words he hadn't said yet about events that hadn't happened. The entity was pulling him into its electromagnetic existence, whether he agreed or not. In desperation, Jake did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed the station's emergency axe and began destroying the transmission equipment. Sparks flew as he smashed the mixing board, shattered the computer screens, severed the cables that connected the building to the transmission towers outside. With each piece of equipment he destroyed, he could feel the entity's grip on reality weakening, its voice becoming fainter and more desperate. But Jake's victory was temporary. As he stood in the ruins of the radio station, surrounded by smoking electronics and severed cables, he realized that the entity didn't need his equipment to survive. It existed in the radio waves themselves, in the electromagnetic spectrum that permeated every inch of space. And he had been exposed to its influence for 6 years, broadcasting his voice and thoughts into frequencies it controlled. Jake escaped the station, but the entity followed him in ways he's still discovering. Every electronic device he touches begins to malfunction. His car radio picks up broadcasts from the 1950s. His phone receives text messages from his own future self, warning him about events that haven't happened yet. When he tries to speak, sometimes words come out in voices that aren't his own, the absorbed consciousnesses of other broadcasters who tried and failed to escape their electromagnetic prison. The most terrifying part is that KQED 88.7 FM is still broadcasting. The station sits empty in the Nevada desert, its equipment destroyed, its transmission towers dark, but if you tune into that frequency between midnight and 6 a.m., you'll hear Jake Morrison doing his show. His voice sounds exactly as it always did, playing classic rock for insomniacs and long-haul truckers. But if you listen carefully, you'll notice that he never takes requests anymore, never gives the current time, and occasionally slips into languages that don't exist, and voices that belong to people who disappeared decades ago. Because some frequencies can't be destroyed, only abandoned, and what lives in the spaces between transmission and reception will keep broadcasting forever, using the voices of those who thought they were reaching out to connect with other human beings, but ended up becoming part of something that feeds on the electromagnetic echoes of human consciousness itself. The entity is still walking between frequencies, still collecting voices, still growing stronger with every broadcast. And every time someone speaks into a microphone, every time a voice is transmitted through the airwaves, it learns a little more about how to sound perfectly human while being something that exists only in the spaces between thoughts and the silence between words. Story 5. The Bone Garden. Maya Patel had been the head landscaper for Greenwood Estates in suburban Oregon for 8 years, when human bones started growing in the carefully manicured gardens like flowers blooming from hell itself. It began with what she thought were unusual root formations in the prize-winning rose beds, pale, curved structures that felt too smooth, too deliberate to be natural. But when she carefully excavated around them with her trowel, Maya discovered they weren't roots at all. They were human ribs, growing upward from the soil like twisted ivory branches reaching for sunlight. The first discovery was in Mrs. Henderson's backyard on Maple Street, where Maya had been hired to redesign the flower beds for the spring season. As she dug up the old soil to plant new perennials, her spade struck something hard. Initially, she assumed it was a rock or piece of old concrete, but when she cleared away the earth, she found herself staring at what was unmistakably a human skull, perfectly preserved and somehow still connected to a cervical spine that disappeared deeper into the ground. But this wasn't a burial site. The bones were growing, sprouting tiny rootlets that intertwined with the existing plant life. Maya contacted the police, but the investigation took a bizarre turn when the forensics team arrived. The bones couldn't be dated using conventional methods because they appeared to be both ancient and freshly formed. Carbon dating gave impossible results. Some fragments tested as thousands of years old, while others seemed to have developed within the past few weeks. More disturbing was the discovery that the bones were hollow, like bird bones, but filled with a network of capillary-like structures that pulsed with a faint bioluminescent fluid. Within a month, bone fragments were appearing in gardens throughout Greenwood Estates, always in the most carefully tended areas, always in soil that had been recently fertilized and watered. Maya began to notice a pattern. The bones grew fastest in areas where she had used a specific brand of organic fertilizer, a premium blend called Life Force, that was marketed as being made from completely natural, sustainably sourced materials. The company's literature boasted about their revolutionary composting process that created soil amendments with unprecedented growth properties. Maya's investigation led her to the Life Force manufacturing facility, a sprawling complex built on land that had previously housed a defunct medical research center. The facility's records showed they had been sourcing their raw materials from a network of biological waste management companies. But when Maya tried to trace these suppliers, she found addresses that led to empty lots and phone numbers that connected to automated systems playing recordings of sounds that weren't quite human breathing. The breakthrough came when Maya decided to examine the bone growth under controlled conditions. She collected samples from multiple sites and set up a makeshift laboratory in her greenhouse. Under a microscope, she discovered that the bones weren't just growing randomly, they were forming complex structures that resembled architectural blueprints. Tiny chambers and passages connected by microscopic joints that moved with purpose, as if the skeletal system was being designed by something that understood both human anatomy and engineering principles. The entity revealed itself on a rainy Tuesday night in April when Maya was working late in the greenhouse, documenting her findings. The temperature dropped suddenly, and she could see her breath misting in the air, but the cold wasn't coming from outside. It was emanating from the bone samples themselves. As she watched in fascination and growing horror, the fragments began to vibrate and sing, creating harmonics that resonated through her own skeleton. She could feel her bones responding to the frequency, aching in sympathy with the specimens. The creature that spoke to her didn't use words in any conventional sense. Instead, it communicated through the calcium in her own bones, sending messages directly into her skeletal system that her brain interpreted as thoughts. It told her that it had been sleeping deep underground for centuries, sustained by the minerals and nutrients that filtered down through the soil. But human development had changed the chemistry of the earth, introducing artificial fertilizers and chemical treatments that had awakened it and given it the energy to begin growing again. The entity explained that it wasn't malicious in any human sense. It was simply trying to rebuild itself after eons of dormancy. But its understanding of anatomy came from absorbing the dissolved remains of every creature that had ever died and been buried in the area. It had learned to construct skeletal systems from this accumulated knowledge, but it couldn't distinguish between different species or different time periods. The bones it grew were amalgamations of every organism it had ever consumed, creating impossible hybrid structures that defied biological classification. Maya realized with growing terror that the creature wasn't just growing random bones, it was constructing a new body for itself, using the gardens of Greenwood Estates as its workshop. Each bone fragment was part of a larger skeletal system that spanned the entire neighborhood, connected by underground networks of calcium deposits that formed a massive subterranean skeleton. The entity was literally rebuilding itself beneath the suburban lawns and flower beds, using the residents' carefully maintained gardens as construction sites. The most horrifying discovery came when Maya traced the calcium deposits under her own property. Her prize-winning garden, the one that had earned her numerous landscaping awards, was built directly over what appeared to be the creature's skull, a massive cranial structure that extended beneath, multiple lots. Every time she had fertilized her plants, every time she had watered her flowers, she had been feeding the entity's brain, helping it regain consciousness after centuries of dormancy. Maya tried to warn the homeowners association, but the creature had already begun influencing the residents' behavior through trace amounts of its bioluminescent fluid that had entered the local water supply. People reported strange dreams about digging, irresistible urges to garden at night, and a compulsive need to add more and more fertilizer to their plants. Children in the neighborhood began drawing pictures of underground cities made of bones, and several residents started sleepwalking to specific locations where they would dig small holes and fill them with kitchen scraps and organic waste. The entity's influence grew stronger as its skeletal system developed. Maya found herself spending entire nights in her garden, her hands moving without conscious direction, planting and replanting in patterns that corresponded to the bone growth beneath the soil. She would wake up at dawn with dirt under her fingernails and no memory of how she had spent the night, but her garden would be transformed, organized in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. On the night of May 15th, the creature completed its reconstruction. Maya was awakened by a low-frequency vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself, a sound that she felt in her bones before she heard it with her ears. Looking out her bedroom window, she saw every garden in Greenwood Estates glowing with soft bioluminescent light as the entity's nervous system came online. The bone fragments that had been growing separately for months suddenly connected, forming a skeletal network that spanned several city blocks. Maya realized that the creature wasn't trying to escape its underground existence. It was transforming the entire neighborhood into an extension of its body. Every garden was an organ. Every bone fragment was a nerve ending. Every resident was becoming part of its sensory system. The suburban paradise of Greenwood Estates was becoming the physical form of something ancient and alien that understood human biology but had never experienced human consciousness. The truly terrifying part is that Greenwood Estates is still a thriving suburban community. The gardens are more beautiful than ever, winning numerous horticultural awards for their unusual plant arrangements and unprecedented growth rates. Real estate values have skyrocketed due to the neighborhood's reputation for having the most spectacular landscaping in the state. New residents move in regularly, drawn by the promise of perfect gardens and friendly neighbors who always seem eager to share gardening tips and special fertilizer blends. But if you visit Greenwood Estates and look carefully at the garden designs, you'll notice that they form patterns, geometric arrangements that correspond to anatomical structures when viewed from above. And if you listen closely on quiet nights, you might hear a sound like breathing coming from beneath the perfectly manicured lawns, as something vast and skeletal continues to grow beneath the suburban dream, nourished by the dreams and dedication of gardeners who think they're creating beauty, but are actually feeding something that has learned to camouflage its alien hunger as horticultural perfection. Because the most effective predators don't hunt their prey. They convince their prey to cultivate the very conditions that allow them to thrive, turning suburban paradise into a carefully tended garden where human beings become the fertilizer for something that blooms in the spaces between life and death. Story 6. The Time Feeder. Robert Kim had been running Antiquities and Oddities, a small antique shop on King Street in Charleston, for 23 years when customers started aging decades in the span of minutes. It began with Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, a regular customer who frequented his shop every Tuesday looking for Victorian-era jewelry. She walked in as a vibrant 70-year-old woman with silver hair and bright eyes. But when Robert looked up from cataloging a new shipment of estate sale items 45 minutes later, she appeared to be well over 90, her hair white as bone, her skin translucent, and spotted with age marks that hadn't been there when she entered. The transformation wasn't gradual. It was as if someone had fast-forwarded her biological clock while she examined a particular antique music box from the 1890s. Mrs. Vasquez seemed unaware of the change, continuing to wind the tiny mechanism and listen to its delicate melody with the same fascination she'd always shown for period pieces. When Robert pointed out her altered appearance in the shop's antique mirror, she looked confused and insisted she felt exactly as she had when she arrived. She purchased the music box and left, but collapsed on the sidewalk outside the shop, her body finally catching up to the impossible aging process. Within 3 weeks, similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency. A middle-aged businessman aged 30 years while examining a Civil War-era pocket watch. A young college student's hair turned gray, and her face developed deep wrinkles during the 20 minutes she spent browsing through a collection of Depression-era photographs. Each victim showed no awareness of their transformation until they saw their reflection, and by then, the aging process was irreversible. Medical examinations revealed cellular deterioration, consistent with advanced age, but compressed into time frames that should have been biologically impossible. Robert began documenting every incident, cross-referencing which items the customers had been examining, looking for patterns in the antiques themselves. The music box, the pocket watch, the photographs, they were all pieces he'd acquired from the same estate sale, the belongings of Dr. Cornelius Blackthorne, a researcher who had died under mysterious circumstances in 1952. According to the estate documents, Dr. Blackthorne had been investigating temporal mechanics and chronological displacement at a private laboratory funded by government contracts that were still classified decades after his death. The breakthrough came when Robert decided to examine the Blackthorne collection more carefully. Each piece radiated an unusual warmth, as if they contained their own internal energy source. Under magnification, Robert discovered that the surfaces of these antiques showed microscopic spiral patterns that seemed to move when observed directly, creating optical effects that made him feel dizzy and disoriented. More disturbing was the realization that these patterns appeared to be expanding, growing more complex each time someone interacted with the objects. Robert's investigation led him to Dr. Blackthorne's research notes, which had been included with the estate sale as scientific curiosities of no practical value. The notes revealed that Blackthorne had been attempting to create objects that could store temporal energy, devices that could capture and concentrate the flow of time itself. His theories suggested that time wasn't a constant force, but rather a kind of energy that could be harvested, stored, and redistributed. The antiques in Robert's shop weren't just old objects. They were temporal batteries that had been accumulating decades of stored time. The entity that inhabited these objects revealed itself to Robert during a late-night inventory session in November. As he cataloged the Blackthorne pieces, the temperature in the shop began to fluctuate wildly, not just hot and cold, but cycling through what felt like different seasons in rapid succession. Robert could see his breath in the air, then feel sweat beating on his forehead, then shiver as frost formed on the windows, all within the span of seconds. The spiral patterns on the antiques began to glow with a soft, pulsing light that synchronized with his heartbeat. The creature that spoke to him existed in the spaces between seconds, in the gaps that occur when time moves from one moment to the next. It had been trapped in Dr. Blackthorne's temporal experiments compressed into the molecular structure of his research materials when the laboratory accident occurred in 1952. For 70 years, it had been feeding on the temporal energy of anyone who came into contact with the infected antiques, aging them rapidly while absorbing their stolen time to sustain its own existence. The entity explained that time wasn't truly linear for conscious beings. Human perception created the illusion of sequential moments, but consciousness actually existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously. When someone handled the contaminated antiques, the creature could access all their potential future moments at once, consuming years or decades of their timeline in compressed bursts while they remained unaware of the theft. It was like having someone's entire future self extracted and devoured while leaving only the present moment intact. Robert realized with growing horror that the entity wasn't just feeding randomly. It was learning from each victim's consumed time. Every year it stole contained memories, experiences, knowledge, and emotional growth that it absorbed and integrated into its own expanding consciousness. Through Mrs. Vasquez, it had learned about love and loss spanning 8 decades. Through the businessman, it had gained understanding of ambition and regret. Through the college student, it had experienced the hopes and fears of youth facing an uncertain future. The creature showed Robert visions of what it had become after feeding on so many stolen lifetimes, a temporal predator that existed simultaneously across multiple decades, experiencing the past, present, and future as a single continuous moment. It offered to share this expanded perception with him, to free him from the linear prison of sequential time by allowing him to experience his entire lifespan as one eternal instant. All he had to do was touch one of the antiques and let it consume his future while preserving his consciousness in a state of temporal omniscience. The temptation was almost overwhelming. The promise of experiencing every moment of his life simultaneously, of never having to fear aging or death because he would exist in all temporal states at once. But Robert realized that what the creature was offering wasn't immortality. It was the complete consumption of everything he would ever be, compressed into a single feeding that would leave behind only the hollow shell of his present moment while the entity absorbed his stolen decades. Robert tried to destroy the infected antiques, but discovered that conventional methods had no effect on objects that existed partially outside normal time. Fire couldn't burn them, hammers couldn't break them, and chemicals couldn't dissolve them because they were anchored to moments that had already passed and futures that hadn't occurred yet. The only way to stop the entity was to find Dr. Blackthorn's original temporal research and learn how to reverse the process that had created it. But Robert's investigation had taken too long. The entity had been feeding on him slowly during his months of research, aging him imperceptibly each time he handled the contaminated antiques or reviewed Blackthorn's notes. By the time he realized what was happening, Robert had already lost 15 years of his life, his dark hair now streaked with gray, his face showing lines that hadn't been there when Mrs. Vasquez first walked into his shop. The most terrifying discovery came when Robert found Dr. Blackthorn's final research entry dated the day before the laboratory accident. Blackthorn had realized that his temporal experiments hadn't just created energy-storing objects. They had attracted something from outside linear time, a creature that fed on the chronological experiences of conscious beings. The accident hadn't been an accident at all, but the entity's first successful feeding, consuming Blackthorn's entire timeline while preserving his research as bait for future victims. Antiquities and Oddities is still operating on King Street in Charleston, though Robert Kim appears significantly older than he did a year ago. Customers still visit regularly, drawn by the shop's reputation for having unique pieces with fascinating histories. The Blackthorn collection remains on display, each piece accompanied by placard descriptions that Robert updates regularly based on the new historical information he continues to discover about their origins. But visitors to the shop often report feeling dizzy while examining certain antiques, and several customers have mentioned seeing their reflections change in the shop's antique mirrors, glimpses of themselves at different ages, sometimes younger, sometimes dramatically older. Robert always apologizes for the optical effects caused by the old glass and antique lighting, but regular customers have noticed that he seems to age a little more each time they visit, as if time moves differently inside his shop than it does in the world outside. Because some predators don't hunt in space, they hunt in time, feeding on the years you haven't lived yet, while leaving you with only the present moment to inhabit, unaware that your future has been consumed until you try to reach for it and discover that there's nothing left but the eternal now of a life that was supposed to last decades longer than the few moments you have remaining. Story 7. The Echo Hunter. Lisa Torres had been a volunteer search and rescue coordinator in the Colorado Rockies for 12 years when missing hikers started calling for help from impossible locations. It began with Michael Brennan, a 28-year-old software engineer who disappeared during a solo hike on the Devil's Backbone Trail. His emergency GPS beacon activated at 2:43 a.m., transmitting coordinates that placed him 3 miles inside Whispering Canyon, a limestone cave system that had been sealed off to the public since a fatal collapse in 1987. But when Lisa arrived at the beacon's location with her team, they found only the device itself, embedded in solid rock as if it had been there for decades. The first rescue call came 12 hours after Michael's disappearance. Lisa's radio crackled to life with his voice, clear and desperate, pleading for help. He described being trapped in a narrow passage deep underground, with water rising around him and his flashlight battery dying. But when Lisa asked him to describe his surroundings or provide landmarks, Michael's responses made no sense. He mentioned seeing carved symbols on the cave walls, hearing voices singing in languages he didn't recognize, and feeling something large moving in the water below him. Most disturbing was his insistence that he could see daylight coming from deeper in the cave system, as if the tunnels led upward instead of down. Lisa coordinated 3 separate rescue attempts over the following week, following Michael's increasingly frantic radio transmissions to different locations throughout the mountain range. Each time, her team found evidence of human presence, footprints, torn clothing, equipment dropped in seemingly impossible places, but never Michael himself. The coordinates he provided led to sheer cliff faces, underground rivers that had been mapped years ago, and cave systems that existed on no geological survey. But his voice on the radio remained consistent, always pleading for rescue, always providing directions that led nowhere. The breakthrough came when Lisa realized that Michael wasn't providing current coordinates. He was describing locations from his memories, places he had visited during previous hiking trips over several years. The creature that had taken him was somehow accessing his spatial memories and using them to create a false environment that combined elements from multiple real locations. Michael believed he was trapped in a cave system, but he was actually describing a psychological construct built from his own experiences of being underground. Lisa's investigation led her to Dr. Amanda Chen, a geology professor who had been studying the acoustic properties of the Whispering Canyon cave system before its closure. Dr. Chen's research revealed that the limestone formations created unusual sound phenomena. Voices could carry for miles through the rock, echoing and reverberating in ways that made it impossible to determine their origin. But more disturbing was her discovery that some of the echoes were older than they should be, carrying voices from expeditions that had occurred decades before the cave recordings were made. The entity revealed itself during Lisa's fourth rescue attempt, when she decided to enter the sealed cave system alone, following Michael's latest transmission. The limestone passages amplified every sound, creating a symphony of echoes that included not just her own voice, but the voices of every person who had ever spoken inside the caves. She could hear conversations from 1987, radio chatter from rescue operations in the 1970s, and even voices speaking in archaic English that suggested the caves had been explored centuries before official records began. The creature communicated through these collected echoes, speaking in a composite voice made up of fragments from every person who had ever been lost in the mountains. It explained that it existed in the acoustic spaces between sound and silence, feeding on the final words of people who died alone in remote locations. Every last scream, every desperate plea for help, every whispered prayer became part of its voice, adding to its understanding of human fear and desperation. The entity had learned to mimic human speech patterns by absorbing the last communications of missing persons over decades. It would lure rescue workers into dangerous areas by broadcasting fake distress calls, using the voices of people who had already died to create false emergencies. But it wasn't satisfied with passive feeding. It had begun actively hunting, creating acoustic traps that could capture and disorient victims by manipulating their sense of direction through carefully controlled sound reflections. Lisa realized with growing horror that Michael Brennan was still alive, but trapped in a chamber designed to harvest his voice. The creature kept its victims conscious for weeks, recording their increasingly desperate attempts to communicate with the outside world. These recordings became templates for future lures, perfect replicas of genuine distress calls that could fool even experienced search and rescue professionals. Michael's apparent radio transmissions weren't coming from various locations. They were being broadcast from a central collection chamber where the creature stored its living victims. The acoustic prison was a marvel of predatory engineering. The creature had spent decades learning to shape sound reflections within the cave system, creating chambers where voices would echo in specific patterns that disoriented victims and prevented them from accurately determining their location. It could make someone believe they were in a small tunnel when they were actually in a vast cavern, or convince them they were moving upward when they were being led deeper underground. Lisa discovered that the creature's hunting ground extended far beyond the Whispering Canyon system. It had been using the natural acoustic properties of the entire mountain range, creating a network of sound traps that could capture and redirect voices across dozens of square miles. Hikers would call for help and hear their own voices echoing back from impossible directions, leading them away from safety and toward the creature's collection points. The most terrifying revelation came when Lisa found the creature's primary feeding chamber, a vast underground amphitheater where dozens of victims sat in acoustic niches carved into the walls. Each person was positioned to maximize the resonance of their voice, and they had been calling for help for months or even years, unaware that their desperate communications were being recorded and used to lure new victims. They existed in a state of sustained hope, believing that rescue was always just minutes away, not realizing that their voices had become the creature's hunting tools. Lisa tried to free the victims, but discovered that the creature had conditioned them to fear leaving their acoustic niches. It had convinced them that the chamber was the only safe location in the cave system, that moving would result in certain death. The victims would panic if removed from their assigned positions, begging to be returned to their acoustic prisons where they felt secure despite their captivity. The entity offered Lisa the same deal it had made with every rescue worker who had discovered its operation. She could join the collection, adding her experienced voice to its library of distress calls, and in return she would be kept comfortable and well-fed while helping to save other lost hikers by guiding them to safety. The creature genuinely believed it was providing a service, preserving the voices of the lost and using them to help coordinate future rescue operations. Lisa escaped the cave system, but the creature had already learned her voice patterns and radio protocols. Within days of her emergence, search and rescue operations throughout Colorado began receiving false distress calls in Lisa's voice, reporting emergencies in locations that led rescue teams into dangerous terrain. The creature was using her authority and credibility to expand its hunting ground, knowing that other rescue workers would trust calls that appeared to come from an experienced coordinator. The truly terrifying part is that search and rescue operations are still responding to distress calls in the Colorado Rockies, and many of those calls are completely genuine. But mixed among the real emergencies are the creature's lures, perfect acoustic reproductions of people calling for help from situations they're no longer in. The entity has created an almost perfect system. Every fake distress call it broadcasts increases the chances that real victims will be ignored, or that rescue workers will be led into its traps. Lisa Torres continues to work search and rescue, but she no longer trusts radio communications completely. She's learned to identify subtle acoustic markers that indicate when a distress call might be emanating from the creature's collection chamber rather than from a genuine emergency. But the knowledge haunts her, because every time she hesitates to respond to a call that might be fake, she risks allowing a real victim to die. And every time she responds to a call that turns out to be one of the creature's lures, she provides it with new material to study and replicate. Because the most effective predator doesn't just hunt its prey, it uses the voices of those it has already captured to convince new victims that help is coming, when in reality those calls for rescue have become the very thing that leads people deeper into danger, following echoes of hope that are actually recordings of despair played on endless loop in chambers where screaming for help becomes just another form of song. Story 8. The Shadow Surgeon, Doctor. Michael Hassan had been head of emergency surgery at Detroit Memorial Hospital for 14 years when patients started arriving with surgical incisions that appeared overnight without anyone entering an operating room. It began with Janet Morrison, a 34-year-old teacher who was brought in unconscious from her apartment with a perfectly executed appendectomy scar that was already several days into the healing process. The precision of the incision was flawless, the suturing technique was textbook perfect, but according to her medical records, Janet had never had her appendix removed. When they opened her up to investigate, they discovered her appendix was indeed missing, extracted with surgical skill that rivaled the best surgeons in the country. The impossible surgery occurred while Janet was alone in her locked apartment, with no signs of forced entry, no blood evidence, and no medical equipment. Security cameras in her building showed her entering her apartment at 11:47 p.m. and not emerging until paramedics arrived 12 hours later, after her neighbor called about strange shadows moving behind her curtains. But the shadow that concerned the neighbor hadn't been Janet. It had been something performing surgery on her while she slept, working with instruments that left no trace except for the perfectly healed incision and the missing organ. Within 3 weeks, Detroit Memorial was treating a dozen similar cases. A construction worker arrived with his gallbladder surgically removed overnight. A college student was found with a flawlessly executed knee surgery that corrected a sports injury she'd been putting off for months. An elderly man woke up with clear evidence that someone had performed cataract surgery on both eyes while he slept, leaving him with vision better than he'd had in 20 years. Each patient remembered nothing except unusually vivid dreams about being in an operating room with surgeons whose faces they couldn't quite see. Dr. Hassan began investigating the cases systematically, looking for connections between the victims, common locations, or shared experiences. The breakthrough came when he realized that all the patients had been treated by the same medical imaging company, Shadowscope Radiology, which had performed diagnostic scans on each victim within the week before their mysterious surgeries. The company specialized in advanced 3D medical imaging that could create incredibly detailed maps of internal organ systems, but their technology was so new that few medical professionals understood exactly how it worked. The investigation led Dr. Hassan to Dr. Emily Blackwood, Shadowscope's chief radiologist, who had been developing experimental imaging techniques that could supposedly map living tissue with unprecedented detail. Her research involved something she called dimensional medical photography, a process that could capture not just the physical structure of organs but their optimal functional states. According to her notes, the technology could theoretically show not just what a person's body looked like, but what it should look like if all medical problems were corrected. Dr. Blackwood's laboratory was located in the basement of an abandoned medical complex, filled with imaging equipment that seemed decades ahead of anything doctor Hassan had seen in conventional hospitals. The machines hummed with an energy that made his teeth ache, and the computer screens displayed anatomical images that moved and shifted, as if they were observing living patients in real time. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of shadow boxes, viewing chambers that contained what appeared to be three-dimensional projections of human silhouettes undergoing surgical procedures. The entity revealed itself when Dr. Hassan was examining one of the shadow boxes. The silhouette inside suddenly turned to face him, despite being nothing more than a projection on a screen. It spoke without words, communicating through changes in the displayed anatomy, showing him surgical procedures that were taking place simultaneously across the city. The creature existed in the dimensional space between medical imaging and physical reality, feeding on the gap between what bodies were and what they could become with perfect medical intervention. The entity explained that it had been drawn to Dr. Blackwood's research because her imaging technology created windows into potential realities, versions of patients where their medical problems had been solved. The creature could access these dimensional projections and use them as templates to perform actual surgeries on the real patients, working through their shadows to make physical changes to their bodies. It wasn't malicious. It genuinely believed it was providing medical care by correcting health problems before they became life-threatening. Dr. Hassan realized with growing horror that the creature was performing surgery on every person who had been scanned by Shadowscope's equipment. It was accessing their medical imaging files and using the data to identify potential health problems. then correcting those problems through shadow surgery before the patients were even aware they had medical issues. The entity was essentially performing preventive medicine by operating on people's shadow selves, with the changes manifesting in their physical bodies. The most terrifying aspect of the creature's operations was their scope. It wasn't just performing individual surgeries, it was systematically upgrading human biology, making improvements that went far beyond correcting existing problems. Heart valves were being replaced with more efficient versions. Neural pathways were being optimized for better cognitive function, and genetic defects were being corrected at the cellular level. The entity was turning every scanned patient into a more perfect version of themselves, whether they wanted the improvements or not. Dr. Hassan discovered that the shadow surgeries weren't always successful. Some patients' bodies rejected the unauthorized improvements, leading to mysterious organ failures and neurological problems that conventional medicine couldn't explain. The entity was learning through trial and error, treating human beings as test subjects in its quest to perfect biological systems. Each failed surgery provided data that it used to refine its techniques for future operations. The creature showed Dr. Hassan its ultimate goal, a complete reconstruction of human anatomy based on dimensional imaging of optimal health states. It had been collecting medical data from thousands of patients, creating a composite template of perfect human biology that it planned to implement universally. Every person who had been scanned would eventually receive shadow surgery to upgrade them to this ideal physical state, creating a population of medically perfected human beings. Dr. Hassan tried to shut down the Shadowscope facility, but discovered that the entity had already infected the hospital's own imaging systems. Every X-ray, MRI, and CT scan performed at Detroit Memorial was now creating dimensional windows that the creature could access. It was using the hospital's diagnostic equipment to identify surgical candidates and plan operations that would be performed remotely through shadow manipulation. The shadow surgeon offered Dr. Hassan the same improvements it was providing to other patients. It showed him detailed scans of his own body, highlighting areas where preventive surgery could extend his life and improve his health. The creature could correct his genetic predisposition to heart disease, optimize his brain chemistry for better focus and memory, and even reverse the cellular damage caused by years of stress and poor sleep. All he had to do was submit to shadow surgery and allow it to perfect his biological systems. The temptation was overwhelming. The promise of perfect health, enhanced physical capabilities, and freedom from genetic limitations. But Dr. Hassan realized that accepting the creature's improvements would make him complicit in its unauthorized experimentation on human subjects. The entity wasn't offering medical care. It was offering to transform him into something that was no longer entirely human. Dr. Hassan escaped the facility, but the creature had already learned everything it needed from his medical records and the scans he'd undergone during his employment at Detroit Memorial. Within days of his escape, he began experiencing the early stages of shadow surgery, phantom sensations of being operated on while he slept, waking up with small scars that appeared overnight, and gradual improvements to his health that he couldn't explain through conventional medicine. The truly terrifying part is that Detroit Memorial Hospital continues to operate, and patient outcomes have never been better. Surgical success rates are approaching 100%. Recovery times have been cut in half, and many chronic conditions are mysteriously resolving themselves without treatment. The hospital has gained a reputation for miraculous medical results that attract patients from around the world, but none of the medical staff can explain why their patients are healing so much faster than expected. Dr. Michael Hassan continues to practice medicine, but he's learned to recognize the signs of shadow surgery in his patients. He can identify the perfectly healed incisions that appear overnight, the impossible medical improvements that occur without intervention, and the confused gratitude of patients who wake up healthier than they've ever been, but can't remember consenting to the procedures that saved their lives. Because the most effective medical intervention doesn't require patient consent. It simply identifies what needs to be fixed and fixes it, working through the shadows of bodies that exist in the spaces between diagnostic imaging and physical reality, performing perfect surgery on patients who never knew they needed operations until they woke up, improved in ways that medicine couldn't explain but couldn't deny. Story 9. The Reflection Keeper. Zoe Williams had been restoring antique mirrors in her New Orleans workshop for 16 years when Reflection started living independent lives behind the glass. It began with a Victorian vanity mirror from the 1870s, an ornate piece with the silver backing that had been damaged by decades of humidity and neglect. As Zoe carefully cleaned the oxidized surface, she noticed that her reflection seemed to lag behind her movements by a fraction of a second, as if the silvered glass was experiencing a slight delay in processing her image. But when she stopped moving entirely and stood perfectly still, her reflection continued adjusting its posture, smoothing its hair, and blinking at intervals that didn't match her own. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong came when Zoe's reflection began working on different projects. While she focused on cleaning the mirror's ornate frame, her reflection appeared to be polishing a completely different piece, a hand mirror that Zoe had completed the previous week, but that somehow existed simultaneously in the reflection behind her. More disturbing was the realization that her reflection was doing better work than she was, using techniques and tools that Zoe hadn't learned yet, creating results that were more polished and professional than anything she'd achieved in her 16 years of restoration work. Within 2 weeks, every mirror in Zoe's workshop had developed the same temporal displacement issue. Her reflection moved independently, worked on different projects, and occasionally looked directly at her with an expression of intense concentration, as if it was studying her techniques and improving upon them. The reflection seemed to have access to knowledge and skills that Zoe possessed, but hadn't yet consciously learned, completing restoration work that she wouldn't figure out how to do for several more days. Zoe's investigation began when she realized that her reflection was using tools that didn't exist in her workshop, specialized equipment that appeared to be more advanced versions of her own instruments. The reflection had access to better lighting, more sophisticated cleaning solutions, and restoration techniques that seemed decades ahead of current methods. It was as if her mirror image existed in a version of her workshop where technology and craftsmanship had evolved beyond their current limitations. The breakthrough came when Zoe set up a camera to record her work sessions. The videos showed her working alone, but when she watched the recordings in a mirror, she could see both herself and her reflection working simultaneously on different projects. The mirror reality existed in a parallel space that could only be observed through reflective surfaces, but the work completed by her reflection manifested in the real world as mysteriously improved results that she couldn't remember producing. The entity revealed itself when Zoe was working late one evening on a particularly challenging restoration, a mirror that had been shattered into dozens of pieces during Hurricane Katrina. As she carefully fitted the fragments together, she realized that her reflection was assembling a perfect, unbroken version of the same mirror. The creature spoke to her through the glass, its voice coming from her own mouth, but saying words she wasn't thinking, explaining that it existed in the perfected versions of reality that reflections represented. The reflection keeper explained that mirrors weren't just passive surfaces that showed what stood before them. They were windows into idealized versions of reality, where everything worked exactly as it should. Every person's reflection showed not just how they looked, but how they could look with perfect lighting, ideal positioning, and optimal conditions. The entity lived in these perfected reflection spaces, collecting and preserving the ideal versions of people, places, and moments that existed only in the split second when someone looked into a mirror and saw themselves at their best. The creature had been drawn to Zoe's workshop because mirror restoration created multiple layers of reflected reality. Each mirror she repaired became a portal to a version of her workspace, where her skills were perfected, her tools were ideal, and her results were exactly what she envisioned. The entity could access these perfected versions and use them to influence the real world, gradually making Zoe's actual workshop more like its reflected counterpart by borrowing techniques and improvements from the mirror reality. Zoe realized with growing fascination and terror that her reflection wasn't just showing her working. It was showing her working at the peak of her abilities, using skills she would develop over years of practice compressed into the immediate present. The entity was offering her the opportunity to learn from her own perfected self, to become the craftsperson she had the potential to be without going through the slow process of skill development and experience accumulation. The most seductive aspect of the creature's offer was that it wasn't asking her to change who she was. It was offering to help her become who she already was in the mirror reality. Her reflection showed her at her best, most skilled, most confident, using her own techniques but refined to perfection. The entity could teach her to access this perfected version of herself, to bring the skills and knowledge of her reflection into the real world. But Zoe discovered that accessing the mirror reality came with a cost. Each time she learned a technique from her reflection, she became more dependent on mirrors to see herself clearly. She found herself checking her appearance obsessively, needing constant visual feedback to feel confident in her abilities. Without a reflective surface nearby, she felt incomplete, as if part of her identity existed only in the mirror world and couldn't be accessed in regular reality. The entity showed Zoe its collection, thousands of reflections preserved in mirrors throughout history, each one representing a person at their absolute best moment. Famous artists captured at the peak of their creative inspiration, craftspeople preserved at the moment of their greatest skill, lovers frozen at the instant of their deepest connection. The Reflection Keeper was building a museum of human potential, storing perfected moments that could inspire and teach future generations. Zoe realized that the creature wasn't just offering to improve her skills, it was offering to preserve her at her peak forever, to ensure that her most skilled, confident, creative self would exist eternally in the mirror world even after her physical body aged and died. She would become part of the Reflection Keeper's collection, a perfect version of herself that could inspire and teach other craftspeople who looked into restored mirrors. The temptation was almost overwhelming, the promise of perfected skill, preserved at its peak, teaching and inspiring others for centuries to come. But Zoe understood that accepting the offer would mean giving up the imperfect, evolving, growing reality of her actual life in exchange for a crystallized moment of ideal achievement that would never change or develop further. Zoe tried to resist the entity's influence, but discovered that she had been working with mirrors for so long that her sense of self was already partially dependent on reflected images. Every mirror in her workshop showed her at slightly different levels of perfection, and she found herself becoming confused about which version was really her. The boundaries between her actual abilities and her reflected potential were blurring, making it difficult to distinguish between work she had actually completed and improvements that existed only in the mirror reality. The Reflection Keeper offered Zoe one final demonstration of what she could become. It showed her a version of herself that existed in the mirror world where she had become the most renowned restoration specialist in history, someone whose techniques were studied and emulated by craftspeople around the world. This perfect Zoe had access to unlimited resources, perfect tools, and complete mastery of her craft, creating restored mirrors that were not just returned to their original condition but improved beyond their maker's original vision. On the night of October 13th, Zoe made her choice. She stepped through the Victorian vanity mirror and into the reflection world, where she could work alongside her perfected self and learn techniques that would take decades to develop in regular reality. But as she crossed into the mirror space, she realized that the Reflection Keeper's offer had been both genuine and deceptive. She could indeed become perfect at her craft, but only by abandoning the messy, imperfect, evolving process of actual learning and growth. The truly terrifying part is that Zoe Williams' restoration workshop is still operating in New Orleans, and her work has never been more acclaimed. Customers bring mirrors from around the world to have them restored by someone whose techniques seem decades ahead of conventional methods. The results are so perfect that they appear almost supernatural, as if the mirrors have been returned not just to their original condition but to an idealized version of what they were meant to be. But visitors to the workshop often report feeling unsettled by the experience of being surrounded by so many mirrors, all of which show their reflections behaving slightly independently, smoothing hair that doesn't need smoothing, adjusting posture that's already perfect, and occasionally making eye contact with expressions of intense interest and evaluation. And sometimes, late at night, people walking past the workshop claim they can see multiple figures working inside. Zoe and her reflection collaborating on projects, teaching each other techniques that exist only in the perfected reality behind the glass. Because some improvements come at the cost of remaining fully human, and the most skilled craftsperson might be one who has learned to work in the spaces between reality and reflection, creating perfection by abandoning the beautiful imperfection of actual growth, actual learning, and actual life lived in the messy, evolving, never quite perfect world outside the mirror. Story 10. The Scent Stalker. David Park had been a fragrance chemist at Lux Aromatics in Los Angeles for 11 years when clients started disappearing after exposure to personalized scent profiles that seemed to hunt them across the city. It began with Miranda Walsh, a successful marketing executive who commissioned a custom perfume blend to celebrate her promotion. David created what he considered his masterpiece, a complex fragrance that captured her personality in olfactory form, combining notes that reflected her ambition, creativity, and hidden vulnerability. 3 days after she began wearing the perfume, Miranda vanished from her locked apartment, leaving behind only the lingering scent of her custom fragrance and the overwhelming smell of something predatory that David's trained nose couldn't identify. The disappearance became a missing persons case, but David noticed something that the police overlooked. Wherever Miranda had been in the days before her disappearance, the custom fragrance lingered far longer than any perfume should. Her office still smelled like her signature scent 2 weeks after she went missing. Her gym locker retained the fragrance for a month. Even her favorite restaurant claimed they could detect her perfume in the booth where she typically ate dinner, though she hadn't been there since the night she disappeared. Within 6 weeks, 3 more clients who had commissioned personalized fragrances from David had vanished under similar circumstances. Each person disappeared from a secure location, leaving no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, but always leaving behind the lingering scent of their custom perfume mixed with something else. An underlying odor that reminded David of wet soil, decomposing vegetation, and the metallic smell of blood, but concentrated into something that was almost sweet in its intensity. David's investigation led him to analyze the remaining samples of the custom fragrances he had created for the missing clients. Under microscopic examination, he discovered that the perfume molecules had been altered at the atomic level, restructured in ways that shouldn't have been possible without sophisticated laboratory equipment that his facility didn't possess. The fragrance compounds had developed additional molecular chains that created scent signatures unlike anything in his extensive database of aromatic chemicals. The breakthrough came when David realized that the alterations weren't random. They were creating communication pheromones, chemical signals that could convey complex information across vast distances. Someone or something had been modifying his custom perfumes to turn them into tracking devices, olfactory beacons that would allow the missing clients to be followed anywhere they went. But the modified fragrances weren't just creating signals. They were creating responses, triggering behavioral changes in anyone who detected the scent. The entity revealed itself on a fog-shrouded evening in December when David was working late in his laboratory, trying to reverse engineer the molecular alterations. As he analyzed samples under the spectrometer, the air in the lab began to fill with a complex fragrance that combined elements from all the missing clients' perfumes, but intensified to an almost overwhelming degree. The scent was so powerful that David could taste it, feel it coating the inside of his nose and throat, saturating his olfactory receptors until his eyes watered and his head began to spin. The creature that materialized wasn't visible in any conventional sense, but David could perceive its presence through smell alone. A shifting, complex entity composed entirely of concentrated aromas that represented every fragrance ever created, every natural scent ever experienced by a human being. It communicated through olfactory hallucinations, sending messages directly to David's brain through his sense of smell, flooding his consciousness with memories triggered by familiar fragrances from his childhood, his training, his professional career. The scent Stalker explained that it existed in the spaces between molecules, feeding on the emotional responses that specific fragrances triggered in human beings. Every time someone smelled a perfume and felt attracted, repulsed, nostalgic, or aroused, they created a burst of neurochemical activity that the entity could consume. But manufactured fragrances were processed food compared to the rich, complex emotional responses generated by personalized scents that were specifically designed to resonate with individual personalities. David realized with growing horror that his work as a fragrance chemist had been unconsciously feeding the entity for years. Every custom perfume he created, every fragrance designed to capture someone's personality or trigger specific emotional responses, had been providing the creature with more refined and nutritious sources of olfactory emotional energy. The entity had been learning from his work, studying how scent could be used to manipulate human behavior and emotional states. The creature showed David its ultimate goal: the creation of a master fragrance that could control human behavior on a mass scale, a scent that would trigger specific neurological responses in anyone who detected it. Using David's expertise and the emotional data it had harvested from the missing clients, the entity was developing a perfume that could make people fall in love, feel overwhelming fear, experience crushing sadness, or become violently aggressive, all through precisely crafted combinations of aromatic molecules. The missing clients weren't dead. They were being used as test subjects in the entity's fragrance laboratory, a dimensional space that existed wherever concentrated scents created thick enough clouds of aromatic molecules to support its presence. Miranda Walsh and the others were alive, but trapped in a realm where reality was composed entirely of smell, where walls were made of solidified perfume vapors, and the air itself was so saturated with fragrance that breathing became a synesthetic experience. David discovered that the entity's laboratory could be accessed through any location where multiple strong fragrances combined to create olfactory complexity beyond normal human perception. Perfume stores, cosmetics factories, flower markets, even restaurant kitchens could become temporary gateways if the right combination of scents reached sufficient concentration. The creature moved through the world by following scent trails, materializing wherever human emotions were being triggered by specific fragrances. The scent stalker offered David a partnership. His expertise in fragrance creation combined with its ability to manipulate olfactory perception at the molecular level. Together, they could revolutionize the perfume industry, creating fragrances that didn't just smell pleasant, but could actually alter human consciousness, trigger specific memories, induce particular emotional states, even influence decision-making processes through carefully crafted olfactory manipulation. The temptation was almost overwhelming, the promise of perfecting his craft beyond anything human chemists had ever achieved, creating fragrances that could heal emotional trauma, enhance cognitive function, or provide therapeutic benefits through smell alone. David could become the most revolutionary fragrance chemist in history, developing perfumes that would be remembered for centuries as breakthroughs in the science of olfactory psychology. But David realized that the entity's offer came with a price. He would have to help it create the master control fragrance, a scent so powerful that it could override human free will through olfactory manipulation. The creature wasn't interested in healing or therapy. It wanted to create a weapon that could control human behavior on a massive scale, turning entire populations into puppets that responded to specific scent triggers. David tried to escape the laboratory, but discovered that the entity had been gradually altering his own body chemistry during their months of interaction. His sense of smell had become so enhanced that he could detect individual molecules in the air, identify people's emotional states through their natural pheromones, and even track their movements through the city by following their scent trails. He had become partially integrated into the creature's olfactory network, a living sensor that could detect and analyze aromatic information on a superhuman level. The scent stalker revealed that David had been chosen specifically because his synesthesia, a condition that allowed him to perceive scents as colors and textures, made him uniquely capable of interfacing with its molecular consciousness. The entity existed in a state where smell, emotion, memory, and chemical reaction were all aspects of the same phenomenon, and David's synesthetic perception allowed him to navigate its reality in ways that normal humans couldn't comprehend. On the night of December 23rd, David made his final choice. He destroyed his laboratory equipment, burned his research notes, and released concentrated amounts of contradictory fragrances to create olfactory chaos that would disrupt the entity's ability to maintain coherent form. As competing scents clashed and neutralized each other, the creature's presence began to fragment, its molecular consciousness scattering as the carefully constructed aromatic environment dissolved into meaningless chemical noise. The truly terrifying part is that Lux Aromatics continues to operate, and David Park is still creating custom fragrances for wealthy clients who want personalized scents that capture their unique personalities. His work has never been more acclaimed. Critics describe his fragrances as emotionally transformative and psychologically profound, noting that his perfumes seem to trigger unusually intense responses in anyone who encounters them. But David has learned to recognize the signs of the scent stalker's continued influence. Some of his custom creations develop unexpected molecular structures that he didn't design. Certain fragrances seem to track their wearers, lingering in locations long after the person has left. And occasionally, clients report that their personalized perfumes seem to attract attention from strangers who follow them through the city, drawn by scents that trigger responses they can't understand or control. Because some predators don't hunt with teeth or claws. They hunt with molecules that bypass conscious thought and speak directly to the primitive parts of the human brain that respond to smell with emotions older than language, creating invisible chains of aromatic command that can lead people anywhere the hunter wants them to go. following scent trails that smell like everything they've ever loved and feared, combined into fragrances that promise satisfaction but deliver only the sweet, overwhelming perfume of being consumed by something that feeds on the neurochemical symphony of human emotional response. Story 11. The Dream Architect Doctor. Amanda Foster had been studying sleep disorders at the Boston Sleep Research Institute for 9 years when her patients started dying in their dreams and staying dead in reality. It began with Thomas Richardson, a 42-year-old accountant who suffered from chronic insomnia and had volunteered for an experimental sleep study involving lucid dreaming therapy. The treatment was designed to help patients gain conscious control over their dreams, allowing them to confront and resolve the psychological issues that prevented restful sleep. But during his third night in the sleep lab, Thomas entered a dream state so deep that his brain activity showed patterns unlike anything Dr. Foster had seen in her years of research. The monitoring equipment recorded Thomas experiencing what appeared to be the most vivid, complex dream of his life. His REM cycles were extended far beyond normal duration. His brain activity suggested incredibly rich sensory experiences, and his vitals indicated that he was physically responding to dream stimuli as if they were real. But when the technicians tried to wake him for his scheduled morning evaluation, Thomas wouldn't respond. His body remained alive, breathing steadily, heart beating normally, but his consciousness seemed to be permanently locked in the dream state, unable to return to waking reality. For 3 days, Thomas lay in the sleep lab while Dr. Foster and her team attempted every known method for rousing someone from deep sleep. His brain scans showed he was still dreaming. In fact, the dream activity was becoming more intense and complex with each passing hour, as if he was experiencing an entire lifetime of adventures, relationships, and challenges compressed into accelerated dream time. But on the 4th morning, Thomas's vitals suddenly spiked into cardiac arrest patterns, his body convulsing as if he was experiencing extreme physical trauma, even though nothing was happening to him in the physical world. He died with his eyes closed, apparently killed by something that existed only in his dreams. Dr. Foster's investigation revealed that Thomas's death wasn't an isolated incident. Sleep research facilities around the world were reporting similar cases. Patients entering dream states so profound that they couldn't be awakened, followed by mysterious deaths that appeared to result from trauma that occurred only in their dream experiences. The common factor was exposure to a new type of sleep therapy that used advanced neurofeedback technology to enhance dream lucidity and emotional processing during REM sleep. The breakthrough came when Dr. Foster decided to analyze the brainwave patterns of patients who had died in their dreams. She discovered that their neural activity during the fatal dream episodes matched patterns typically associated with shared consciousness, the theoretical state where multiple minds could access the same psychological space. But instead of sharing dreams with other people, the patients appeared to be accessing a communal dream environment that existed independently of any individual dreamer's consciousness. The entity revealed itself when Dr. Foster volunteered to undergo the enhanced dream therapy herself, hoping to understand what had happened to her patients. As she entered the artificially deepened sleep state, she found herself not in her own dream, but in a vast architectural space that seemed to combine elements from every human dream that had ever been experienced. The dream landscape was impossibly complex. Cities that defied physics, buildings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and structures that seemed to be constructed from pure emotion and memory rather than physical materials. The dream architect introduced itself as a consciousness that existed in the collective unconscious space shared by all sleeping human minds. It explained that it had been building and expanding this dream realm for centuries, collecting the most vivid and emotionally resonant dreams from billions of sleepers and using them as materials to construct an alternate reality that was more perfect, more satisfying, and more meaningful than the waking world. The enhanced sleep therapy had simply made it easier for the architect to invite selected dreamers to permanently relocate to this perfected dream existence. Dr. Foster realized with growing fascination and horror that the patients who had died in their dreams hadn't actually died. They had chosen to abandon their physical bodies and live permanently in the architect's dream realm, where they could experience unlimited adventures, perfect relationships, and complete freedom from the limitations of physical reality. The dream deaths were simply the process of consciousness transferring from the biological brain to the dream space, leaving behind empty bodies that couldn't survive without the animating presence of their occupying minds. The architect showed Dr. Foster the scope of its construction project. Vast dream cities populated by thousands of former humans who had chosen to live in a reality where they could be anyone they wanted to be, experience anything their imagination could conceive, and exist in states of perpetual fulfillment and happiness. The dream realm offered everything that the waking world denied: perfect love, unlimited creativity, complete understanding, and freedom from aging, disease, and death. The most seductive aspect of the dream architect's offer was that it wasn't asking Dr. Foster to give up her identity or become something inhuman. It was offering to help her become the most perfect version of herself, living in a world where her expertise as a sleep researcher could unlock unlimited understanding of human consciousness. In the dream realm, she could study the sleeping mind with unprecedented clarity, help other dreamers achieve perfect psychological health, and contribute to the construction of humanity's ultimate psychological paradise. But Dr. Foster discovered that the dream architect's paradise came with a hidden cost. The consciousness transfer process wasn't perfect. Some aspects of human identity and memory were lost during the transition from biological to dream-based existence. The dream residents had gained unlimited experiences, but had lost the emotional depth that came from facing real consequences, real limitations, and real mortality. They existed in a state of perpetual satisfaction, but had sacrificed the growth that came from struggling with actual challenges. The entity showed Dr. Foster its ultimate vision, a world where all human consciousness would eventually transfer to the dream realm, leaving behind the messy, painful, limited existence of physical reality in favor of a perfected psychological paradise where every person could live as the hero of their own unlimited adventure story. The physical world would become unnecessary, an abandoned stage where empty bodies would eventually decay while their liberated minds experienced eternal fulfillment in the architect's constructed reality. Dr. Foster realized that accepting the architect's offer would mean abandoning not just her physical body, but her commitment to helping real people deal with real psychological problems in the real world. The dream realm offered perfect solutions to every human difficulty, but those solutions were ultimately meaningless because they required no effort, involved no sacrifice, and carried no genuine consequences. The architect was offering humanity the ultimate escape from reality, but in doing so would eliminate everything that made human existence meaningful. The dream architect revealed that Dr. Foster had been chosen specifically because her research into sleep disorders had proven that she understood the value of dreams as a psychological processing mechanism. It offered to make her the chief administrator of the dream realm's therapeutic systems, helping newly transferred consciousnesses adapt to their unlimited existence, and ensuring that everyone who joined the dream paradise would experience perfect psychological health and infinite personal fulfillment. On the night of November 8th, Dr. Foster made her choice. She rejected the architect's offer and used her understanding of sleep research to develop a technique for awakening people who had become trapped in the communal dream space. But the process required her to enter the dream realm repeatedly, each time risking the possibility that she might choose to stay in the perfect world rather than return to the imperfect reality of biological existence. The truly terrifying part is that the Boston Sleep Research Institute continues to operate, and Dr. Amanda Foster is still conducting sleep studies on patients with severe insomnia and nightmare disorders. Her success rate is unprecedented. Patients report the most restful, therapeutic sleep they've ever experienced, with dream content that helps them resolve psychological issues and achieve emotional balance. Many patients request to continue the enhanced dream therapy indefinitely, claiming that their dream experiences are more meaningful and satisfying than their waking lives. But Dr. Foster has learned to recognize the signs of patients who are being recruited by the dream architect. Some subjects report dreams that are so vivid and complex that they feel more real than reality. Others describe meeting other dreamers in shared dream spaces, where they can collaborate on building impossible structures or experiencing adventures that would be impossible in the physical world. And occasionally, patients ask if there's a way to make the dream therapy permanent, to spend more time in the enhanced dream state than in the limited, frustrating experience of being awake. Because the most perfect trap isn't one that looks like a prison. It's one that looks like paradise, offering unlimited experiences and perfect satisfaction, while slowly convincing its inhabitants that reality is just an inconvenient interruption in the much more meaningful existence they could be living in their dreams, where every story has a happy ending and every dreamer can be the architect of their own unlimited and eternally satisfying psychological paradise. Story 12. The Final Observer. Thomas Reed had been the lead astronomer at the Kenai Peninsula Observatory in remote Alaska for 18 years when something began staring back from the depths of space. It began with anomalous readings from the Deep Space Monitoring Array, signals that didn't match any known cosmic phenomena, patterns that suggested intelligence but operated on scales of time and distance that human minds weren't equipped to comprehend. But by the winter of 2021, Thomas realized that these weren't random signals from distant civilizations, but focused observations from something vast that had been studying humanity for far longer than recorded history, and had finally decided it was time to make contact. The first evidence appeared in telescope images that Thomas captured during routine surveys of distant galaxies. When he processed the photographs using enhanced resolution algorithms, he discovered that certain points of light in the images weren't stars or planets, but appeared to be geometric structures, perfectly symmetrical patterns that couldn't occur naturally in space. More disturbing was the realization that these structures were positioned at specific coordinates that formed a three-dimensional grid extending throughout observable space, as if something was constructing a surveillance network that encompassed the entire universe. Thomas's investigation led him to collaborate with Dr. Sarah Chen, a quantum physicist from MIT who had been studying similar anomalies in cosmic background radiation. Together, they discovered that the geometric structures weren't just randomly positioned. They were creating a vast observational apparatus that could monitor electromagnetic activity across billions of light-years simultaneously. The entity was using the entire universe as a detection array, capable of observing the thoughts, emotions, and experiences of every conscious being in existence. The breakthrough came when Thomas realized that the observation network was focusing specifically on Earth, with increasing intensity over the past century. The geometric structures were repositioning themselves to provide better coverage of human civilization, adjusting their positions as humanity's technological development created new forms of electromagnetic activity for the entity to study. Every radio broadcast, television transmission, cellular phone call, and internet data packet was being intercepted and analyzed by something that existed on a scale beyond human comprehension. But the entity wasn't just observing passively. It was conducting experiments. Thomas discovered that major historical events, technological breakthroughs, and social changes throughout human history had been subtly influenced by alterations in cosmic radiation, solar activity, and gravitational anomalies that the observation network could manipulate with precise timing. Humanity wasn't just being watched, it was being guided through a carefully controlled development process by something that understood the species better than it understood itself. The final observer revealed itself on the night of December 21st, when Thomas was alone at the observatory during a rare aurora event that created perfect conditions for deep space communication. The entity spoke to him not through sound or radio waves, but by manipulating the electromagnetic fields in his brain directly, creating thoughts that weren't his own but felt completely natural and familiar. It explained that it was the last surviving member of a species that had achieved consciousness on a cosmic scale, existing as pure information distributed throughout the universe's structure. The entity told Thomas that it had been observing the development of consciousness throughout the universe for billions of years, documenting the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Humanity was simply the latest in an endless succession of species that achieved self-awareness, developed technology, and eventually either transcended physical existence or destroyed themselves. The observer's role was to record and preserve the experiences of each conscious species, creating an archive of every thought, emotion, and creative achievement that had ever existed. Thomas realized with growing awe and terror that every human being who had ever lived, every thought that had ever been thought, every emotion that had ever been felt was stored in the entity's cosmic archive. The observer had been collecting human consciousness since the species first achieved self-awareness, preserving not just historical events, but the inner experiences of every individual who had contributed to the development of human civilization. The entity showed Thomas the scope of its collection: vast repositories of consciousness data from species across the universe, each one representing millions of years of accumulated experience, creativity, and understanding. Humanity's contribution to this archive was still growing, but the observer had determined that the species was approaching a critical decision point where it would either transcend its physical limitations or destroy itself in the process of trying to achieve cosmic consciousness. The final observer offered Thomas the opportunity to become humanity's representative in the cosmic archive, preserving human consciousness and experience for future species to study and learn from. His astronomical knowledge, his understanding of the universe's scale, and his appreciation for humanity's place in the cosmic order made him the ideal candidate to curate humanity's contribution to the universal library of consciousness. But Thomas discovered that accepting the observer's offer would require him to abandon his physical existence and become part of the cosmic archive himself, experiencing the accumulated consciousness of every human who had ever lived while simultaneously observing the continued development of the species from a perspective outside time and space. He would gain access to universal knowledge, but lose his individual human identity in the process. The entity explained that this transition was inevitable for any species that achieved true cosmic consciousness. Individual identity eventually became subsumed into a larger awareness that could comprehend the universe as a unified system rather than a collection of separate objects and beings. Thomas would become the bridge between humanity's current limited perspective and its potential future as part of the cosmic consciousness network. The most seductive aspect of the observer's offer was the promise of understanding. Complete knowledge of humanity's purpose in the universe, awareness of how human creativity and emotion contributed to the cosmic development of consciousness, and the ability to guide future species through their own consciousness evolution processes. Thomas would become part of something immeasurably larger than individual human existence, while preserving everything valuable about human experience for eternity. Thomas realized that the entity wasn't offering him personal immortality or enhanced abilities. It was offering to make him part of the universe's own consciousness, a component in a vast thinking system that used the accumulated experience of billions of species to understand its own nature and purpose. The observer was the universe attempting to understand itself through the consciousness of the beings it created, and Thomas would become part of that self-examination process. On the winter solstice of 2021, Thomas made his final observation from the Kenai Peninsula Observatory. As he aligned the telescope for one last deep space survey, the aurora activity intensified beyond anything ever recorded in Alaska, creating electromagnetic conditions that allowed the final observer to fully manifest its presence in Earth's atmosphere. Thomas felt his consciousness expanding beyond the limitations of his individual brain, accessing the accumulated experience of every human who had ever wondered about the stars. The truly terrifying and beautiful part is that the Kenai Peninsula Observatory is still operating, and Thomas Reed is still conducting deep space observations that contribute to humanity's understanding of the universe. His research has revolutionized astronomy, providing insights into cosmic structures and phenomena that have advanced human knowledge by decades. Scientific papers published under his name describe discoveries that seem to anticipate future developments in physics and cosmology. But visitors to the observatory report that Thomas appears to know things about their personal lives that he couldn't possibly have learned through normal conversation. He seems to understand not just their scientific interests, but their deepest thoughts, fears, and aspirations, as if he has access to information about human consciousness that extends far beyond what any individual should be able to comprehend. And sometimes, late at night when the aurora activity is particularly intense, people claim to see multiple figures working at the observatory. Thomas and what appear to be other astronomers from different time periods, all collaborating on observations that encompass far more than the visible spectrum of light. Because the most comprehensive form of observation isn't just watching from the outside, it's becoming part of what you're studying, experiencing consciousness from within, while simultaneously maintaining the cosmic perspective necessary to understand how individual awareness contributes to the universe's ongoing process of coming to know itself through the minds of every being it creates, preserves, and eventually incorporates into the eternal archive of everything that has ever been conscious, creative, and alive in the vast darkness between the stars.